here's China in 1950. This little blob here at the bottom, that's what happens when foreign troops stop rampaging through your village. You have a birth boom. 30 years later, this is the demographic structure that terrified Mao Zedong. He was afraid that a young, growing generation of Chinese were literally going to eat the country alive. His solution? A one-child policy. 20 years after that, this is the demographic structure that scares Americans. We see a bottomless supply of young Chinese workers who are taking everybody's manufacturing jobs. This is also the demographic structure that excites the Chinese Politburo, because they see it as a bottomless supply of young Chinese consumers remaking global norms. We're both right. We were both right, because this is 20 years ago. Here's China today. Now, this is according to data from January of 2020. At that point, China was already the fastest aging society in human history, and it was aging towards oblivion at a rate we couldn't even consider possible until 10 years ago. According to this data, China by the year 2100 will have less than half the population it has today. Since then, the Chinese have started releasing bits and pieces out of their 10-year census. They now believe that they've overcounted their population in excess of 100 million people. The best guess that we have from what they have chosen to share is that the yellow bars don't even exist. If this is true, China's population will drop by half by 2050. Most of us are going to live to see the end of the Han ethnicity, much less the People's Republic. The question is, how does it go out? That's only one reason I'm really not bullish about the Chinese system. The Chinese import over 80% of their oil needs, and about 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf. It is the single most exposed trade route on the planet. Now, the Chinese do have a lot of ships. Most of them would fit on this stage. Only about 10% of the Chinese ships can actually sail more than 1,000 miles from a friendly port, and the Chinese have no friendly ports outside of the PRC, which means they can't patrol that trade route. In the case of a war, a real war, the countries that have the capacity to destroy China as a modern industrialized country include, but are not limited to, India, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, Taiwan, the United States, and Japan. You put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean, 3 months later, the trucks stop running, 6 months later, the lights go out, and a year after that, they lose 500 million people from famine. The Chinese are utterly dependent on the world that the United States maintains in a globalized fashion. We go home, it ends. We are the single greatest ally and empowerer of today's China, and we've lost interest in globalization. There's a reason that the Chinese are sounding really desperate and really belligerent and really bitter. They know it's almost over. We recently struck a deal to provide them with some very cool military equipment. Now, publicly, what everyone seems to grab onto are those nuclear submarines, and I don't mean to suggest that those aren't sexy pieces of equipment, but we're also giving them air-launched cruise missiles. Maximum range of the existing Australian fighter bomber fleet with these cruise missiles can reach here. If they just launch them from their own terrestrial airspace, it reaches here. There's the Strait of Malacca. The Australians, a country of 30 million people, can now bring China to its knees. That's how vulnerable they are. China has gotten interesting from my point of view. Chairman Xi has consolidated power unto his person to a degree that not even Mao attempted. It is a full cult of personality. He has executed or exiled or intimidated into silence everyone in the country who is capable of an independent opinion. And he has shot the messenger, sometimes literally, so many times that no one wants to bring him bad news. You guys remember when the power outages started in China last May? At one point, over a third of the country was experiencing rolling blackouts. They still haven't stopped. Best guess is that Chairman Xi was not aware of it until September. We didn't get a policy adjustment. No one wants to tell him bad news. This is not how a functional country works. We also know from countries like Chile and the UAE who have used the Chinese vaccine is that it's crap. It doesn't work against Alpha, much less Delta, much less Omicron. So China can never move away from a zero tolerance strategy because the healthcare impact upon the population would be crushing until such time that they say, oh yeah, we're going to bring in 3 billion doses from the United States. They're stuck. And so we're seeing increasingly frequent lockdowns. China is inadvertently breaking itself away from global manufacturing. And with a population that is physically incapable of mass consumption, exports are the only game in town. So if the Chinese system can't guarantee demographic survival or financial stability or an export market or even basic health, what's left? For those of you who watch agriculture, which is probably nobody, this is a nice little shot from 2019. The Chinese are experiencing an outbreak of what is called African swine fever. It's kind of the pig equivalent of Ebola. It's really nasty. They culled over 2/3 of their herd. Pork plays a role in Chinese culture equivalent to hamburgers and steak and chicken and bacon and fish in this country. It is the protein everyone goes for. The Chinese swine herd is bigger than the rest of the world's combined, and they culled more pigs in China in the last 3 years than exist on every commercial farm in the rest of the world combined. They are now attempting to rebuild the herd because this is all they have left. And if you are going to raise 100 million pigs, you've got to feed them a lot quickly. So the Chinese are buying up every scrap of food they can find anywhere on the planet, even if it isn't normally designed for pigs. So they're buying broken rice out of India, they're buying high-grade baguette wheat out of France, everything. The only other thing that the Chinese care about besides the pigs is rice. They know that they're a food unstable country, and they are terrified that the bottom's falling out of that too. So they have recently criminalized the export of phosphate-based fertilizers. China's land is low quality. They don't have an internal transport system except for in regions that they're concerned are secessionist. And then they are surrounded by a belt of useless lands that they can't really patrol effectively. And because of the first island chain, they can't project power out except now when the United States has put everybody on the same side with globalization. So I see the overall geographic underpinnings of Chinese power being completely resting upon the United States nullifying their geographic disadvantages. And so the idea that if the Chinese think that they can move beyond economics as the basis for power, they really do have nothing left. I mean, the Chinese ethnicity, the Han, have been there for over 3,000 years, but they've only been able to be a united entity that is relatively secure in their borders for about 10% of that time, and half of that is under the American-led order. So if we remove economics from the equation, this ends a lot faster. Also, let's assume for the moment that China just wanted to displace us and use more or less our management system. They don't have the naval forces to get past the first island chain, much less secure the Persian Gulf energy routes. And let's assume that they could. Do you really think that, like the United States, they're going to fight wars in the Middle East so that their allies can access oil? No, that oil would be for them. So the guns and butter trade that we made with the world, they are not capable of doing. He knows that either the Americans will leave, in which case the basis of Chinese power collapses, or the Americans won't, and they will become hostile to China, in which case the basis for Chinese power collapses. And in that sort of environment, being able to define the narrative becomes critical. Because in an authoritarian, a dictatorial system is really what they are now, a fascist dictatorial system, the only way you can maintain power is if the people choose to let you. I didn't worry about a war in Taiwan until very recently. The Chinese didn't have the naval capacity. Even if they did, they couldn't operate the semiconductor fab facilities. They were too advanced. The technology that actually makes TSMC run is from the United States. It requires American designs. And then they're still 5,000 miles from their energy source. Made no sense. Made, past tense. If the financial and the demographic and the trade and the agricultural system are all facing threat at the same time, there's something to be said about choosing the time and the place of the fight and writing the narrative. It will come at the cost of a modern industrialized economy, and agriculture is an industrialized sector. But I think if Xi's position is, if I can maintain power for the low price of only 500 million dead Chinese, that's worth it. So now I kind of give a Taiwan invasion like a 1 in 3 chance.